Well, welcome everybody. We are delighted that you could join us for a little while this afternoon or evening, depending on where you are across the country. Already we see that we are kind of going coast to coast today, and we love seeing that. If you have an opportunity, use that chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen and tell us what state it is that you're representing today. Already we see that we're going from Virginia all the way to Washington, so let's see if we can fill in some more of that middle section of the country. There's one from Louisiana. Fantastic. So today we're very fortunate to have with us Margit McGuire, the author of Story Path. And I know that Margit will share with you, but Margit has been working with this design for 25 years, and she works with this design in classrooms with real teachers and real students, so she knows that the program actually works. I think that's one of the best things that we can say about programs as we look at them, that they've actually been tried and true in a classroom. It's a real pleasure, Margit, to have you with us. It's not often that we get to have such a great, prestigious author. So thank you for taking time out to be with us today. And I'm going to turn the training over to you and let you do the one that does all the talking and sharing today.
Thank you, Pam. I'm happy to be here today and talk about this strategy that I am passionate about and excited to share with people. As I'm talking about Story Path and today's topic, the first Thanksgiving, the Wampanoags experience, I hope you'll use that chat space to ask questions. So as Pam has shared, I've been working with this strategy for many, many years, and I feel very fortunate that classroom teachers, not only here in the Pacific Northwest, but in other parts of the country and the world, have let me come in and work in their classrooms side by side with the teachers to pilot the curriculum and to think more deeply about the curriculum. In working with the strategy, I've always placed a high priority on going into classrooms that are highly diverse, because I think fundamentally, if it's successful in those classrooms, it has a good chance of being successful in other classrooms as well. So my time with you today is going to be focusing on, if I can get this to change, okay, here's what I'm thinking that we will do. So I thought we would start today by looking at one story path in depth, and this is a timely one with Thanksgiving just around the corner. Then I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about asking questions and making connections, and you'll see throughout this presentation that I am making direct connections to the Common Core and the C3 framework. Then I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about the possibilities for Story Path with other topics, and I'll share with you the particular ones that focused on history from primary through middle school. So with that overview, let's get started. So for those of you that may be unfamiliar with Story Path, I would share that this strategy originated in Scotland, and it's about 35 years old. And it is a fairly simple concept, and one that was really intriguing to me when I was introduced to it. It's taking the notion of story and the elements of story, setting, characters, and plot, and taking a social studies topic or a history topic and putting it into a story. But unlike reading a great historical novel, the students become the characters in the story. And I think that is what makes this strategy so incredibly powerful. So each student in a classroom can find a place to be part of the story and raise questions, connect with the experiences of a particular time and place. And I think for many kids who come from low-income backgrounds or from other places in the world, or may even be students that are struggling because of a learning disability, we find that in our research working in this with this strategy out in schools that students do remarkably well. So as I go through today and talk about how this works, I'm hoping that you'll see the connections that I'm making as we begin to think about a particular topic. So this topic, I often think I was challenged to write about this as a topic when I looked many years ago at a number of curriculums that focused Thanksgiving primarily from the Pilgrim's perspective. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to look at this topic from a different perspective? And that led me to thinking about the first Thanksgiving from the Wampanoags experience. And I have to say, I'm really proud of this topic. I have the good fortune of being advised by a Wampanoag person that at the time was working at the Plymouth plantation. She oversaw all of the art materials, and in fact, she had said to me that she wasn't sure she wanted to do it because too many times when she'd been asked to consult on a curriculum, people didn't pay any attention to what she shared with them. And I promised that I would take very seriously the feedback that she would give me. And I think we all know that there's this topic in particular has a lot of mythology around it. So it was important for me to get it right. And thanks to her, I think we've achieved that. So as I began to think about studying this topic with primary age students, and I think as we talk about this, you'll see ways that you could adapt it for older students as well. We started with the setting of the eastern woodlands in the winter. And we did that because we wanted students to be able to think about the geographic setting. So we have in the curriculum wonderful visuals that have been reviewed by the expert in the field to make sure that it is accurate and representative of that time and place. So the story begins with the eastern woodlands and thinking about what that geography and climate would be like. Then we introduce the families that lived there at the time. And then we move into springtime where we build context and deepen students' understanding of what it would be like to live a long time ago in that part of the world, followed by thinking about what is summer like for the early people of the eastern woodlands. And then we get into the critical incidents, or the heart of the story, where we consider Squanto and the Pilgrims coming into this place and how do we respond to them, as well as looking at what actually happened when Squanto came back and interacted again with the families that lived there. So the concluding event is Thanksgiving, and in an ideal world, this would be great to time this particular unit. So as kids were getting ready to celebrate the holiday of Thanksgiving, they would culminate with their own Thanksgiving event related to the story path. So that takes us into how do you get started to the story. So here's how we start out a story path, and it's fairly typical of most stories. So we start with either a reading, or in some cases we will do a brainstorming. But because children may or may not know much about the eastern woodlands a long time ago, we start with a description. And this is the description that we read to students. And in reading this to students, I've been conscious of trying to blend together terms that may be known or unknown to students to begin to help them picture in their mind what was the eastern woodlands like when the Wampanoag people lived there. And so as you can see, I won't read all of this, but just to give you a flavor, when I go into a classroom to work with a group of students, I say, we're going to be part of a story. And in this story, we need a place. And you're going to help me create this place. So listen carefully and try to imagine what this place might look like a long time ago. So then I start with, it is a long, long time ago, and our story begins in the winter. Everywhere I look, it is winter. The rounded hills in the distance have a carpet of snow. The snow is deep, and the pine trees are bent with thick layers of snow on their branches. The oak and maple trees stand naked in the snow. Their leaves are long gone. They look cold and stiff as their branches reach to the gray sky. So with that, reading through that, I'm introducing some language that may be unfamiliar to students, and especially to students who may not live in that part of the country. So they may not, for example, know what a muskrat is, or for that matter, a wild turkey. And students in urban areas may know even less of what it would be like. But we try to picture in their minds what this place is. And then, if necessary, we can add pictures that are included in the content slides, which show drawings of what that part of the world looks like in winter. So thinking about the Common Core, we give students an opportunity to read or listen to such a reading, and so this, I think, connects really well to helping kids from a reading standpoint think about craft and structure. We also want to build a word bank as we move in further to the story, and of course we're going to help students use that vocabulary in the context of the story, both reading about it, talking about it, and writing about it. So with that reading, there's some practical considerations. What we're doing at the very beginning by reading the introduction to the setting is we're trying to activate students' prior knowledge, what they already know about the time and place, and connect it to what we want them to learn. So we're focusing in, of course, on the geographic setting and the climate, and introducing the academic language. Then as we think further about it, we want to highlight for the students what are some things that we remember about the setting, generating a list of ideas, and then we're going to actually have kids create that visual setting. And I think what's really, really important in doing this is for kids who have English as a second language or are unfamiliar with a place such as this, we're going to try to help them visualize it and create this setting. We find that doing this is really, really important in that it hooks kids in. This is probably one of the most favorite parts of the story path, and every child can be successful. So along with this, we're also really fostering social emotional learning. And what I like about StoryPath, because it replicates real life, is that we give kids the opportunity to be in real life imagining how you work through these kinds of problems. So of course, the first task is to figure out how they're going to create their frieze, or another word for frieze is mural. And we're going to have students work in groups to do that. So within the curriculum, we have particular portfolio guide sheets that teachers can use if they so choose to help kids kind of set up for success and thinking about how we're going to negotiate the making of this particular place. So what it requires is some wall space in the classroom, a lot of art materials that students can use to think about how they're going to use tissue paper, for example, to maybe make trees, or helping them use cotton balls to make snow. And I see a number of you living in areas where you don't get a lot of snow. I think kids really get excited when they think about imagining a place with lots of snow. So as we get together and start to think about creating this setting, we're going to organize students into small groups, give them tasks, talk a little bit about background and foreground and how to make some art representations of trees and the various things that we see in the setting, which I mentioned can be the animals, which they love, the trees, the snow, the rivers, the ocean, and all of the things that go with that. So this gets the kids invested, and typically when I go into a classroom and do this, I say, let's just set aside a chunk of time and just do it all at once, because kids actually love this part and they would do it for days and days if you let them. So I say, let's get all the art supplies out, let's make our setting, and then be done with it so that we can move on to the story. I think it's really important for students to not only think about how they're going to work together, but then go back and think about how they did. And so again, in the portfolio, we include opportunities for teachers to reinforce that with, you can see the portfolio 3 self-assessment on working together. So lots of opportunities to talk about, well, how did we decide where to put the trees? How did we decide where to add in the different animals and so forth? So in doing this, of course, there's a lot of commotion going on in the classroom, and it is not a quiet activity. So I'm going to stop at this point and see if anyone wants to ask a question.
If you have a question, you can type it there in your chat or ask me to unmic and let you talk, and I will be glad to do that. If you have a question.
So I'm thinking I must be perfectly clear or perfectly confusing because no questions are coming. So I'm moving ahead. So after we get the visual setting created, we want to talk with kids about what have you created, what do you see there. This gives students an opportunity to point out their beautiful tree or their wonderful raccoon or their rocks on the beach or what have you. This I have found in classrooms where there are a high number of English language learners is a way for them to feel like they're fully engaged in the experience. And in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was in a classroom where we had 2 Korean students who spoke no English and were pulled out for part of the day to get support. But the day we were there for social studies, they were there, and we had them engaged in creating the setting, and they could look at what other students were making. We spent some time helping translate some of the words to describe what the setting was, and they were fully engaged in the experience. And as I looked at those 2 students, I thought to myself, wow, how hard this must be to be in a classroom where you are brand new to the United States and you're trying to make sense of what's going on every day in a classroom where there's a lot of language, and how do you engage and participate in that. So those 2 students were fully engaged that day and actually were able to contribute and point to what they contributed, and I felt like that was a real successful day for them. So after we have the setting created and a chance to talk about what it is and reinforce the academic language, point out where are they in this whole area of working together, and where are they in terms of making things for the setting, and what's going to happen to their story, we find that lots and lots of kids are engaged and excited and have something to say, and I think that's really important. So to reinforce that learning, we think that it's important for students to write about the setting. So another, coming from multiple intelligence kind of perspective, we're talking, we're constructing, we're writing, we're reading. So all of those things are in play as we begin a story. And in this case, we're suggesting that students do a fairly simple writing activity, which I love. It's called a sense poem. You can see it set up to say, I see, I hear, I touch, I smell, I feel. And it's a fairly simple way to help kids connect some writing to the experience. So here's an example of what students had written in the piloting of the curriculum. More recently, I had a student work with me to, actually one of my student teachers came in and shared with me what one of her students had done in her classroom. Again, the curriculum provides guide sheets to help students do that writing. Before they get into it, you're going to spend some time generating a word bank to help reinforce and extend that language. So in this case, lots and lots of adjectives to describe the place as well as what's in the place. So let me show you what one young man did. And I think this is a great example. I see birch trees standing in the valley. I feel soft snow touching my skin. I hear swift hares hopping through the snow. I smell smoky salmon cooking in the long house. I taste cold deer dropping down my mouth. Dropping down. I hope that's cold deer and not droppings now as I'm reading this, but I taste cold deer dropping down my mouth. So this kind of writing tells me that the student is understanding what's available in the setting, is able to imagine the setting and being in that setting, and clearly the teacher has spent time helping them generate a list of adjectives to help make that writing richer and more meaningful for the kids. So that completes the first episode of A Story Path. So now we're going to think about the question, how are the Wampano families created? And when I'm working with students, I usually start with, who might live in this setting a long, long time ago? And in doing that, we begin to ask the students to think about, well, who are the families that lived here? Now remember, we're still pretty early on in the story, and because this one is really looking at young children and thinking about families and generating who might be in the family. So you're asking lots and lots of questions about who are the members of a family. And of course, we know students will bring what they know from their own experiences, and we know families come in all shapes and sizes these days. So making those lists of family roles for students to think about is really important, and I think validating for kids, because we're really acknowledging the range of family makeup. And for our story, the families that live in the village, they too would have come in all shapes and sizes. So we'll generate a list of family roles, and then we'll begin to put students in groups. And again, this is a teacher decision if you want students working in pairs or in groups of 3 or 4. Those are decisions that teachers make, and we make suggestions in the curriculum, but then we always say the teacher knows best. So in that case, they put themselves into, or the teacher organizes them into families, and then they begin to think about what their role will be in the family, because we're going to ask each student to play a role in the family. So they get to decide, am I going to be a mother, a father, a grandparent, a child? We try to discourage them from being babies, because we want them to be able to have a role when critical events happen. So we want them to be old enough to take on that role as we talk about the critical incidents. So we're going to have them do the artwork first. And the reason for this is we found over time is when they create the visual representation of their family member, they tend to write more when they sit down to write the biography for their family. And we found this is true whether we're talking about primary, intermediate, or middle school students. We have in the curriculum a number of suggestions and ways you can create the visual representation of families. The most common one that teachers use is kind of a paper doll approach, and all that material is there to set that up. In this case, this particular teacher that was kind enough to share her students' work simply had them create the head, and the students drew that and then drew something that was representative of the native people of that time and place. We talk about the names, and we know that Native American people have very complicated naming processes that change over time depending on what particular tribe they might be from or what age they are. That level of detail for younger children we tend not to delve into, but certainly teachers could choose to do that if they wanted to. But we also are cognizant that we want students, as they begin to venture into a story like this, that they don't immediately go to stereotypes. So we give teachers some suggestions about how to talk about names and be respectful of people's names from the past so that we don't end up with stereotypes or names that might be offensive to others. So generally students are respectful of that. They're trying to imagine themselves in that role. So this young man here has created Strong Hawk. He is going to be a character in this story. And once he has his visual created, then we're going to walk through what his name is, how old he is, his family role, his personality, and what special skills he might have living in this village a long time ago. And before we have the students actually do that writing, we do a brainstorming for possible names, ages, family roles, personality, and special skills. So when students get ready to do the writing, they have a word bank and a set of things to draw on so that we can help them write more realistically and accurately about their character. And once that is set up, then we want the families to introduce themselves to the class so they get a sense of who are all of the people living in the village. This happens over a number of days, and it's a great way for kids to work on core competencies related to speaking and listening. And again, there are portfolio guide sheets that help students do those help the students do the introductions as well as listen to think about who else is in the village beside their own family and character in that family. So again, we're weaving in Common Core skills in the context of the story. And again, what we're finding from our students that are doing this is they have a reason to read, write, listen, and speak because it takes the story forward. So again, I think the richness of this particular approach is that the reading and writing and speaking and listening is done in context. And I think that makes it very powerful. And we find that kids who sometimes struggle seem to do better when they have a real solid purpose. So that is generally the second part of any story is you start with the setting, then you start with the characters, knowing as you move through the story that students are going to gain greater information and deeper information to elaborate and build on what they know from the first 2 episodes. So I'll take a moment and see if people have questions. Okay, so I'm going to move on to what we're talking, or what we think about as building context. And so now we have kids hooked. They've got their character, they've got their setting. Now we can begin to have them think more deeply about the time and place in which this story takes place. And so one of the ways that we're going to do that with this particular story is to have the students think about, okay, we know what it's like in the winter. Now let's begin to think about what is life like when we go from winter into spring. And we have them then begin to look at their setting and think about how will that setting change. And so for young children, we're going to ask them to begin to think about changing their setting to make it look like spring. So we're going to introduce to them ways in which the climate is going to melt the snow and the leaves will come onto the trees. And so we're going to use that setting and change it by adding things like leaves and flowers and grass and maybe even some animals that will come out of hibernation. So students, again, are excited about this because they're very interested, of course, in the animals that live in this setting and the way of life that people are experiencing. So from spring, we go into summer and we begin to think about, all right, now we have summer. What will summer be like? And then we begin to think about the village and the homes that people will live in. And so we're going to begin to think about how we're going to meet our basic needs. What kind of homes do the people live in the summer? And we'll begin to create that. So here's another student example where they're talking about the hogans that were built. And again, having students write about the setting and demonstrating their understanding of how people live in this time and place. And I think this is a great example from this student who described what his house looked like and then went on to say, make comparisons to how it might look today. With that, we're also going to spend some time thinking about what are the basic needs of the people: food, clothing, and shelter. And again, the content slide sets give students accurate information about how people lived. Students will then create the village to add to the setting, and then they're going to do some writing about a typical day. So again, helping them imagine, well, what goes on in the day in the summer, and how are we going to get our food? Where will we get our food from? What kinds of things will we be doing during the summer when the weather is warmer and the animals are out and about and the trees are on the leaves? And again, how are we going to build our, get our food that we need? So I see a question about, are students familiar with the Native Americans and do they have prior knowledge about the topic? Generally, this is a decision the teacher has to make. Generally, we start in with the setting, linking what kids already know to what they can imagine about New England. Teachers often supplement that with additional reading or textbooks or student literature. We also have the content slides that support students understanding. If, for example, I'm thinking of students that would be, well, here in Seattle where I live, students have a good sense of the Northwest Coast people because of the environment, but they wouldn't necessarily have a good sense of the Eastern Woodlands Native Americans. So we'd probably do some comparing and contrasting from what they know about life here in the Northwest and the water and the trees. But then we think about, well, what might that look like on the eastern side of the country. Sometimes teachers fear that students won't be able to do any of this work because they don't know enough. And our experience over time is that when you get into this, you know you're creating a need to know. And so students are often curious and want to find out more information. We want to guide them to make sure that they are doing things as accurate as possible and that they can go in and make changes and when they discover new information or have a better understanding. And we certainly aren't going to let stereotypes stand. For example, if they decide they want to do tents, similar to the Plains Indians, we would want to talk about why that might not work in the eastern woodlands, given the climate and the amount of moisture that comes down in the winter. I hope that answers your question. So the question about I think the question about do they need additional information before you start, I think that's a teacher decision. I think some students are great to just jump in and learn as they go, and other teachers are more comfortable with building some background knowledge first. So and you'll see suggestions around that in the curriculum. We say you can do it this way or you can do it this way, and why you would choose to do it one way or the other. So, excuse me, we want to scaffold student learning again. We want students to write in context. So again, we go back to the portfolio, which you can choose to use with students, or you may have other approaches you want to use for writing, but this is designed to scaffold student learning with a set of questions that you've already talked about and read about and added to your frieze or your settings, so that when you go to do the writing, you're setting them up with some key questions for getting them to do the pre-writing, and then the opportunity for them to write about the summer day in the eastern woodlands for the Native people. So we tried to do this in all of our curriculum units. All of them have portfolios. They all have guides that teachers can use as a starting point or use as is, depending on what their particular needs are for their classrooms. So that sets us up for beginning to think about the critical incident. And so remembering our history from most of us learning it from the Pilgrims' perspective, we know that they came to the eastern woodlands. They were not fully prepared for the climate or the environment that they would be living in. And so this sets up the opportunity for students to think about if they're living in this village, and now here we have some newcomers coming in to our environment. And so they come with Squanto, which is reflective of the historical record, to begin to think about what are we going to do. So we have a community leader that's going to lead the discussion when we introduce the critical incident, so that students can begin to think about, okay, we have these newcomers, they are strangers, they live very differently from us, and they are really, really having a hard time because this winter has been very severe, and they were not prepared for this kind of bad climate. So in the curriculum, we provide some background information for both the teacher and the students to think about what actually happened. Many of you may know about Squanto, and he was befriended the Pilgrims, and he served as an interpreter for the Pilgrims to the Wampanoag people. He spoke English, and he seemed to be able to converse back and forth. So as he came into the village, he was able to speak to the people of the village. So the historical record shows that when Squanto was a boy, he had spent 7 years in Europe, basically taken captive and taken back there. And he came back to Cape Cod in 1619. So he had a pretty good understanding of the Pilgrims' way of life, as well as the people who, of course, were indigenous to that area. So he was in that area and served as an interpreter between the two groups of people. And so this is a way that we role play for students how this might take place. And this is where I think students really get excited, because they get to take on the role, imagine themselves as the people in the village, and then think about, what are we going to do? We have these strangers in our midst who are really suffering, and in fact seem to be having a hard time meeting their basic needs. So how are we going to respond? Let me just take a moment to talk about the value of role play. I think we don't do enough of that in schools, and I think it becomes really, really important for kids to build empathy and understanding when they have to enact the roles of someone else. And we build this into critical incidents throughout all the different story paths, so that we can help students really try to imagine and understand another time or another place or another set of experiences that they may not have personally experienced themselves. We've also found that for English language learners, that they are often willing to jump in, and even with limited English, try to imagine themselves in those settings and learn the discourse of a time and place and practice that academic language in a context. So this is a really important part of every story path, and it can be short. It can be opportunities for kids to just speak for short periods of time. The other beauty of the story path is you can be in role, you can stop the role play, you can reflect on what's happened in the role play, and then you can go back into the role, so that we're really building students' understanding for a particular event that they're experiencing. So again, there's common core connections, students speaking and listening or writing about their experience, again, built into the curriculum as you make your way through the story events. So, of course, we know that Squanto came with the problem to be solved, and the question that students had to answer was, will we help the Pilgrims or not? And of course, we think that young children will have that sense of care for others, and so we hope that they will say, yes, we will help them. And so, again, this visual that you see before you, I think, is a great example of showing how the Wampanoag people are teaching the Pilgrims how to plant the food from that region and fertilize it with the fish and make things productive. And again, I'm proud to say that this has been reviewed by a Wampanoag from the Pilgrim plantation, and she verified its authenticity as we put together the curriculum for use by, we hope, all of you. I'd like to also just make a comment about the content slides, which are available for teachers to use as students need to increase their content knowledge of a time and place. This is a pretty typical way in which they're set up, with clear questions to guide them in reading about a particular topic, and opportunities for them to also be supported with visuals that support the language of the text. Of course, we come to the end of the story, in which we would celebrate the Thanksgiving event, and this would be a great way for the teacher to be able to bring students into a Thanksgiving event with the Native Americans joining the Pilgrims. And I've often thought it would be great if a corresponding classroom might be the Pilgrims, and perhaps the two groups could come together to celebrate a Thanksgiving event in the classroom. So all stories need a sense of ending, and this one, of course, is a natural one because of the Thanksgiving event itself happening. So to just go back for a moment, that is how this particular story path unfolds. Let me just go back and review for a moment to talk a little bit about the structure. So every story path is going to start with a scene, character, and plot with the problems to be solved. The structure of the curriculum in delivering it for kids is set up so that most of the time the teacher is asking questions, trying to guide students to figure out what might have happened, how they might have figured things out in that time and place. So the curriculum includes key questions throughout the story path, and then accompanied with opportunities for students to read, write, speak, and listen, and doing that literacy in context. So it's a fairly straightforward approach, and again, as I said, typically most story paths start with a setting followed with the characters, and then building context to deepen their understanding, to help them learn more about their time and place, so that they're set up to figure out what the critical event might be and how they might go about solving it. So in this case, an essential question for this story will be, will you help the strangers who are in a bit of a predicament in this time and place in the past? So what our research shows, and looking at other research that looks at project-based learning, we're pulling some of that basic understanding about excellent pedagogy when we think about high student engagement, memorable in this way because the story, we know the human mind brings together experiences through story. And I think for this particular strategy, and what's made me so excited to work with it over time, is that it really does capture the human ability to think about time and place through story. Only in this way, we're having kids become the characters in the story. So they're then having to deal with the problems that the events propose. They get an opportunity to perhaps, in this case, go back and look at the real historical events to say, well, this is how we solved the problem. Is that how the people at that time and place solved the problem? The other thing that we see happening, and we've done some research recently on looking at the social emotional aspect of this in terms of building empathy for others, being able to walk in other people's shoes and imagine what that feels like, to be able to talk about those social emotional problems that may be encountered through the story, seems to have a high level of engagement for students and really builds that understanding. And that's what our research is showing, and this is where we put some emphasis most recently. And then I think the students' notion of feeling like they can figure it out for themselves, that they can make this work and they can have a role in the story, and that their ideas are valid and important and can be shared with others. I want to just highlight my email address, that I'm always willing to respond to people. So if later you want to know more about this particular presentation, please feel free to email me. I'm more than willing to respond. We really see that this whole notion of real life applications is critically important for learning, and I think this is the power of this particular approach. And obviously I'm the author of this strategy. I'm not the originator. It originally came from Scotland, but I've tried to think about it in the American context. So StoryPath comes both in a box and an electronic version. And you see it comes with a teacher handbook. It comes with a set of content cards, which provide the background knowledge that's important for students to understand the content. It comes with a set of portfolios to guide students through different experiences and support their learning. And that makes a really comprehensive package. Along with that, I won't go through all of these things, but each of the handbooks for the teacher includes a real clear guide for teachers. You can see on the far right-hand side, there's an overview that's provided for that particular episode, and then you go on with more detail and options for how you might bring this forward for the students. The student portfolios are set up so they can be reproduced, and in the electronic version, you can actually use them on a computer. So if students have access to computer for their learning, they can respond directly on the portfolio in the computer, and that works really, really well. The content cards or the content slide sets are set up, as I shared earlier, with key questions to guide the reading, and then follow-up questions to help make sure students are understanding what they're reading, and lots of ideas for how to organize students for small groups or large groups to think about their own learning. Let me just share a couple of others in the few minutes we have remaining. Here is another story path. We were trying to think about how do we help students learn about another place in the world and make that believable and realistic. We know that a lot of children might not know much about Kenya or the Masai Mara, and so they actually go as photographers to photograph that part of the world. So they create the setting, they become the photographers, they pack a suitcase, and they head out to find out about the Masai Mara in Kenya. They also have the opportunity to learn about the Masai people. So they have an opportunity to replicate a typical village in the Masai Mara. They do animal reports in a travel journal. And then the critical incident there is a misunderstanding, because of course we know when people are very, very different from us, it would be easy to misunderstand or maybe even at times be rude, not because we mean to be, but just because we don't know enough. And so with young children, we present this as a problem and think about how do we respond to people who are very different from us, and what if we make a mistake? How do we say we're sorry? And how do we really try to remember that people who are different are still people who have some of the same ways of knowing and being as we do as ourselves. And so that is an opportunity, again, for kids to engage in that self-reflection and thinking about understanding others. Another story path for older students is called A Nation Divided, and this of course follows the Civil War. We actually set this story path in Chattanooga because it was a historic place for both being occupied by the Confederate Army and the Union Army. We've included a primary document of a person who lived there at the time, so the students begin to think about what were the real challenges of living in Chattanooga while the Civil War was starting to happen, and then all of the events that led up and resulted in actually being occupied by both the Confederate Army and the Union Army. And what did that feel like if you were a person living in that town and that time and place? So this shows you another example of how a teacher has created the setting, and a detailed view of, she in this case used boxes to create the homes. And again, we're guiding students to keep it historically accurate. They're given opportunities to do further research. One of the critical incidents is townspeople have been accused of being on the Underground Railroad and hiding slaves. And so students have to decide how they're going to respond to that. So lots of opportunities for reading and writing in context. Another opportunity to think about coming to America, and this is a great topic today as we think about immigration. We can also think about immigration in the past and what was it like to get on a ship and come here. So these are the families coming from Europe back in the early 1900s, and what was their experience like. There's another story path that looks at this topic of immigration from the Chinese railroad experience. So again, trying to give students many different perspectives of this topic of immigration as we've considered in our past. I know many teachers have the challenge of a broad topic, like I need to understand ancient civilizations, and I have India and China and Africa and perhaps Australia. And so we have a strategy that we've used the notion of a museum as a way to do a more overview look of a time and place, where the exhibits then form the basis for doing a more survey approach of a topic where you might not have the ability to go into a lot of depth. And so they create museum exhibits as a way to dig more deeply into that survey approach to a topic. So it might be states that you might be examining, it might be other places in the world, and you just simply organize the museum with that focus, and they have to deal with the setting up the exhibits and the brochures for that. Some like to do this topic related to ancient Egypt, and so this one does allow for you to go into more depth. So this is a village that is in ancient Egypt, and one of the challenge, of course, is that this society lived for a long time without a lot of critical events. Working with an Egyptologist, we discovered that there was a time of about a 30-year drought, and that in fact did cause some unrest. And so that's built into this particular story path for students to figure out what they did when they almost found themselves without food and water, living in a very dry climate. So another opportunity that sets a historical event in an accurate context for students to think about. There is an array of story paths that I've listed here, including one we talked just briefly a little bit earlier about the struggle for independence, and that is set in colonial Boston. And here's a set of ones that are focusing on world history. So I see that my time is up. Thank you for listening to me talk for almost an hour straight, and I appreciate your willingness to stay with me, and I'm again more than happy to answer email questions or any other way in which you want to reach out to find out more about StoryPath. And I know that Pam can tell you lots more as well. So thanks everyone for staying with me today.
Margit, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your insights and helping us all to understand fully what StoryPath has to offer. What a fabulous resource. I'm seeing lots of great comments over in the chat section. If you do have a question for Margit, please do go ahead and put that in your chat. Like I said, this is being recorded and it will be shared out with you tomorrow through email, so where you can go back and retrieve it, view it again, or share this with your colleagues. But what a great treat it was to have you on tonight, Margit. And I really appreciate you being with us and taking time to go through this process with us to help us all have a better understanding. I hope that everybody gets out there and gets busy using them like right away. Go back and get started tomorrow.
So let me just say we will be doing sessions at the National Council for the Social Studies on StoryPath, and we're hoping to come to San Antonio for the history conference that I believe is in March or April. And we'll be hoping to share more about StoryPath in those two settings.
Fabulous. So if you're going to NCSS or if you're going to NCHE, be sure to check the list of sessions for Margit's sessions on StoryPath. Again, everybody, thanks for being on tonight. We appreciate it so much, and we look forward to you joining us for another webinar in the near future. Good night, everybody. Good night,
Bye-bye.
Margit.
Bye-bye.